There was once a king whose name was spoken in low voices. His armies were strong, his walls were high, his commands were obeyed before they were fully spoken. When he entered a room, people lowered their eyes. When he frowned, the air itself seemed to tighten. And yet, when night fell, and the torches dimmed, and the long halls of the palace grew quiet, the king could not sleep. He would lie awake beneath heavy curtains and carved ceilings, staring into the dark. No enemy stood at his gates, no rebellion stirred in his lands. The kingdom was calm, but his mind was not. It replayed every word spoken that day, every look, every pause, every whisper he thought he heard. They had bowed, yes, but did one of them hesitate? They had praised him, but was their doubt hidden behind the praise? A single glance could follow him into the night. A single sentence could echo for hours. Why did it disturb him so deeply? Why did the smallest tone feel like a threat? He had power, he had authority, he had fear on his side, and still something inside him trembled. Sometimes he would rise from his bed and walk the long corridors alone. His footsteps were the only sound. The guards stood still as statues when he passed. They did not dare to meet his eyes. He believed this was respect, but in the silence of those midnight walks another thought would come to him, soft and unwelcome. Was it respect, or was it fear? And why did fear feel so fragile? During the day, his anger came quickly. If they spoke too slowly, he corrected them sharply. If they disagreed, even gently, his voice rose like sudden thunder. He told himself this was strength. A king must not appear weak. A king must not allow doubt. But each outburst left something behind, a heaviness, a tightness in his chest, a strange emptiness. Once the moment had passed, he began to notice it. After anger there was no peace, only more thinking, more watching, more suspicion. He tried to silence his mind the way he silenced others, with force. He told himself not to care. He told himself to ignore small things. But thoughts do not obey commands. They returned, they circled, they waited for him in the dark. Sometimes he would sit at the edge of his bed and stare at his hands, hands that had signed decrees, hands that had pointed in judgment, hands that had never trembled in battle. And yet now they felt restless. What was he fighting? There was no enemy in the room, no one speaking against him, only silence. But in that silence he felt exposed. It is a strange thing to rule an entire kingdom, yet not be able to rule a single thought. The king began to see something he had never noticed before. His anger was not protecting him, it was exhausting him. Each reaction tied him to the words of others. Each burst of temper handed them a quiet power over his mood. If they whispered, he reacted. If they hesitated, he reacted. If they looked uncertain, he reacted. Who then was truly in control? This question did not shout. It did not accuse. It simply sat beside him in the dark. He had built walls of stone around his kingdom. But inside himself, there were no walls, only open doors through which every word could enter. And so the king lay awake again, listening. Not to the palace, not to distant guards, not to the wind beyond the windows. He listened to his own breathing. Slow, uneven, restless. For the first time, he did not blame them for his sleeplessness. He wondered quietly if the unrest was his own. The crown rested heavily on his head, though it was made of gold. During the day it shone brightly, it reflected light. It reminded everyone who stood before him of his authority. But beneath its weight, his thoughts moved without rest. They had learned his temper. They spoke carefully around him. Their words were polished. Their faces were controlled. Yet even in their caution he sensed something unsettled. A pause that lasted too long. A breath that felt misplaced. A glance that shifted too quickly. Small things, very small things. But in his mind they grew. He would sit upon his throne and watch the hall before him. The room appeared calm. Voices were steady. Movements were measured. And yet inside him, noise gathered like distant thunder. Why did their silence feel louder than their speech? Why did their obedience not bring him peace? If someone offered advice, even gently, he felt resistance rise in his chest. If someone questioned a decision, even softly, his jaw tightened. As if every difference in opinion was a hidden challenge. And so he answered sharply. His words became quick. His tone became firm. Sometimes it became cutting. The hall would grow still. They would bow deeper. They would apologize. And in that moment, he felt relief. Brief relief. But later, when the hall emptied and he sat alone, something else followed. A strange distance. He began to notice that fewer voices spoke freely in his presence. Conversations shortened when he approached. Laughter softened when he entered a room. It was subtle. No one dared to show defiance. Yet warmth slowly disappeared. He told himself this was discipline. A kingdom must be orderly. A ruler must be feared to be respected. But another thought, quieter and harder to face, lingered in the corners of his mind. If they are afraid to speak, how will I ever hear the truth? Still, when discomfort rose, he reacted. It was easier to correct others than to sit with his own unease. It was easier to raise his voice than to examine the sting he felt inside. Each reaction gave him a feeling of control, yet each reaction also tied him tighter to the very things that disturbed him. A whisper would upset him. A rumor would disturb his sleep. A single look would follow him through the day. He began to see that his anger did not silence the noise. It fed it. The more he reacted, the more he watched. The more he watched, the more he suspected. The more he suspected, the more restless he became. It was a circle without rest. One evening, after speaking harshly over a minor disagreement, he noticed something in the eyes of the one standing before him. It was not rebellion. It was not hatred. It was withdrawal. A quiet closing. That look stayed with him, not because it threatened his throne, but because it revealed something he had not wanted to see. His anger was building walls inside the hearts of others, and those walls were slowly building one around him. He sat alone again that night, the palace silent. He removed the crown and placed it beside him. Without it, he felt strangely exposed. Who was he without reaction? Who was he without the quick defense of pride? For a moment he did nothing. He did not justify himself. He did not blame them. He simply allowed the discomfort to remain. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but also honest. He realized that the true noise was not in the hall. It was not in whispers or glances. It was inside him. A mind that needed to be right. A heart that feared being questioned. A pride that could not bear the smallest bruise. The crown had not created this noise. It had only revealed it. And as he sat there in the dim light, listening to the quiet around him, he began to understand something gentle but powerful. The greatest battle in his kingdom was not outside his walls. It was within the space of his own thoughts. And no army could fight it for him. The morning came as it always did. Light moved slowly across the stone floors. The palace stirred. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors. Another day of decisions waited for him. He placed the crown upon his head with steady hands, but something inside him was different. The night before, he had not argued with his thoughts. He had not defended himself in silence. He had simply watched the noise rise and fall. It had been uncomfortable, but it had passed. That morning they gathered before him as usual. Their faces were careful, their words measured. The air held its familiar tension, thin and fragile. A small disagreement arose. It was nothing serious, a minor matter of direction. Yet the tone carried a hint of duty. A pause. A suggestion that differed from his own. He felt it instantly. The tightening in his chest. The quick heat rising toward his face. The old habit knocking at the door of his mouth. This was the moment they expected. The flash of irritation, the sharp reply, the reminder of who held power. He felt the words forming. And then he noticed them, noticed the heat, noticed the tightening, noticed the urge. He did not push it away. He did not obey it either. He simply let it exist. For a brief second, the room felt suspended in time. They waited, eyes lowered, breath held, and he said nothing. The silence stretched. It was not the heavy silence of fear. It was not the sharp silence after anger. It was still. Inside him, the storm searched for movement. It expected to be released. It expected to explode and disappear as it always had. But he did not give it a voice. He listened instead. The suggestion was repeated, softer this time, not as a challenge, but as an offering. He heard it fully, without defending, without preparing a reply, just listening. Something strange happened in that pause. The heat in his chest did not grow. It did not burn endlessly as he had feared. It softened. It moved through him like a passing cloud, and beneath it there was space, clear, quiet space. He realized something in that moment. Anger had always promised him strength, but silence felt stronger, because silence required him to hold himself, to endure the discomfort without throwing it onto someone else. They shifted nervously, unsure of what his quiet meant. Was it calm? Was it gathering force? Was it a warning? He could see their uncertainty. And for the first time, he saw how often his reactions had shaped the room, how every raised voice had tightened shoulders, how every sharp word had narrowed the air. Now, without reaction, the room began to breathe, slowly. He asked a simple question, not to challenge, not to correct, but to understand. The tone of his voice surprised even him. It was steady, not forced, not cold, just steady. They answered cautiously at first, then more clearly. The conversation moved forward without the edge it once carried. And he felt something unfamiliar. Not dominance, not victory, but dignity. The kind that does not depend on being right, the kind that does not fear being questioned. When the discussion ended, there was no heavy silence left behind, no lingering tension, no regret waiting for him later, only calm. As the hall emptied, he remained seated for a while. He expected to feel weaker. He expected to feel that he had lost something by not asserting himself. But he had lost nothing. Instead, he felt lighter. He understood then that his anger had never been proof of power. It had been proof of impatience, of insecurity, of fear that disagreement meant disrespect. But this quiet restraint felt different. It did not shrink him. It expanded him. He had not silenced them. He had silenced the impulse inside himself, and in doing so, he had discovered something greater than control over others. He had touched control over his own mind. That day, the kingdom did not change. The walls remained the same. The throne remained the same, but within him, a new kind of strength had begun to take root. It did not shout. It did not demand attention. It simply stood, calm and steady, where anger once ruled. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand announcements, no sudden transformations that shook the palace walls. The kingdom continued as it always had. The sun rose, the court gathered, matters were discussed. But something quiet had shifted. The king began to notice the space between a feeling and a response. Before, that space had been invisible. A spark would rise, and his words would follow without pause. Now he could see the spark clearly. He could feel it forming in his chest, warming his face, tightening his breath, and he would wait. Just a moment. Sometimes only the length of a single breath. In that small pause he found choice. They still disagreed at times. They still made mistakes. They still whispered when they thought he was not near. The world had not become perfect simply because he had grown quieter, but he no longer chased every whisper. He no longer answered every glance. He began to understand that not every sound requires a reply. At first they were unsure of him. When he did not react as before, They watched carefully. Was this calm real? Or was it simply a different kind of warning? But calm, when it is steady, does not need explanation. Over time, the air in the hall grew lighter. Words were offered more freely. Questions were asked without trembling. Laughter, once rare in his presence, returned softly. He noticed this, not with pride, but with quiet awareness. Respect felt different from fear. Fear had always been sharp and immediate. It forced obedience quickly, but it left distance behind. Respect moved slowly. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It grew in silence, like roots beneath the soil. And he realized something simple. When he controlled his reactions, he was no longer controlled by them. An insult left unanswered lost its weight. A rumor ignored faded on its own. A disagreement explored calmly often revealed wisdom he might have missed. He had once believed that strength meant overpowering every challenge. Now he saw that strength sometimes meant letting the challenge pass through him without resistance. Was it weakness to remain silent? Or was it a deeper form of mastery? In the quiet of evening, he found that sleep came more easily. His mind no longer replayed every conversation with sharp edges. There were still thoughts. Of course, a ruler always carries responsibility. But the noise had softened. He no longer needed to defend himself against every imagined threat. He no longer mistook pride for dignity. Sitting alone one night, he held the crown in his hands and looked at it carefully. It had not changed. It was the same gold, the same weight. Yet it felt lighter now. Because he no longer used it to shield his insecurity, he wore it with steadiness, not tension, and in that steadiness he discovered a quiet truth. The greatest kingdom is not the land outside the walls, it is the space within the mind. A mind ruled by impulse is a restless land. A mind ruled by patience is a peaceful one. They still bowed when he entered the room. But now some also met his eyes, not with fear, but with trust. And trust, he understood, is not demanded. It is earned in silence. It is built in the moments when anger is possible, yet withheld. He did not become softer in judgment. He did not abandon authority. He simply carried it differently, like a calm river that moves with strength yet without noise. In the end, the kingdom was not transformed by his power, it was transformed by his restraint. And as the palace slept under the quiet sky, the king rested too. Not because the world had become silent, but because he had learned to quiet himself.